Hey guys, Emily here, owner and program director at Relentless. So about every month, as a team, we go through different research articles and we critically review them as a team. And we thought that this one was a really applicable one that we wanted to discuss within our community. So today we're chatting about ACL injury toward a gendered environmental approach. This is a review article that was published in 2021. So as a quick review, we always like to discuss the 5 phases of evidence as it comes to different review articles. So the least evidence, or let's say the weakest type, is an expert opinion or a critical review, versus the strongest is a systematic review. And a systematic review basically looks at all of the different research articles on a certain topic out there, and it really looks at all of the different conclusions, and then from there creates one collective conclusion of what is currently known about a certain topic. So this one is about ACL injuries and looking at ACL injuries from a gendered perspective versus a sex perspective. So that really means is that if we look at ACL injuries, what we do know is that females are 3 to 6 times more likely to experience an ACL injury compared to males. And over the past 20 years, we have looked at this difference in terms of sex differences. In terms of, is it anatomy? Is it because females are built differently than males? Is it because they have different hormones than males? And despite looking at these two really main areas, this rate of incidence has not changed over the past 20 years. Instead, it's actually increased in collegiate athletes. So we seem to be missing something. This approach doesn't really seem to be helping the overall goal, and that's reducing the chance of ACL injuries in females. Other things that we know is that if you have an ACL injury, there's a much greater chance of you experiencing osteoarthritis as you get older. And that finally, most important known point of information right now is that ACL injuries, when non-contact, are overuse injuries. Meaning over time, the athlete has exposed that tendon to too much, or that ligament to too much loading than it has the capacity to handle. And that one movement where it snapped, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. But it took repeated instances leading up to that moment and under recovery that led to this overuse injury. So with that, this article really provides cases against the current view of looking at sex differences. And the first is a case of biomechanics. And this really suggests that if female and male athletes move differently because of their gender, we would see that at the point of injury, there'd be a different movement. But instead, there is no difference in biomechanics at the point of injury. Again, further clarifying the fact that ACL injuries, when non-contact, are overuse injuries. And that if the position of a body at the instance of injury is the same, but girls have a much greater incidence of injuries, this suggests that biomechanic differences are an insufficient explanation. Next to that is a case against anatomy. And anatomy really refers to this original idea of looking at females versus males compared to their Q angles, which is actually not even scientifically cited as a specific angle, but it's theorized as this angle between the hip, like your femur, and the knee, and that females, because they should have wider hips, that they therefore have a wider Q angle, and that's going to lead to a more susceptible ACL. Same with that as a notch size. So your notch is basically where your femur head fits into your hip. And if females have a smaller notch, so that's going to increase the chance of, again, leading that ACL to being more susceptible. This article really provided a case against it, continuing to cite that, again, we haven't seen a change over the past 20 years when we look at this. And this is a really important point of information, is because our tissues adapt. And soft tissues, meaning your ligaments and tendons, and your hard tissues, like your bone, will adapt and model according to the forces which they're subjected to. And this is the cornerstone of really any type of preventative, rehabilitative exercise program. So this means that your ligament laxity, your ACL size, and the femoral notch size are all modifiable depending on external forces that we expose on it. Furthermore, the structure of the ACL can change with loading. So citing that, well, females have a higher chance of injury because they're born that way, is insufficient, because we can change how an athlete's soft tissues are actually modeled by external loading. So with that concept, as a team, we really looked at an article that we wrote a couple years ago, and that really talks about the paradox of a female in sport, a female an athlete, and it really kind of gives you a timeline of the history of women in sport, the history of actual science of strength training, and then the percentage of females that are required to strength train, and the percent of ACL injuries. So big picture is that females were, Title IX didn't happen until 1971. It took 10 years for the NCAA to finally allow female athletes to compete under their umbrella. So we had a huge spike in females that are competing at this really high competitive level that have never been seen before. At the same time, the sport of bodybuilding is starting to emerge, and the public is now perceiving strength training for females to create this hyper masculine look, which is not true, because the sport of bodybuilding is a sport in itself, and females do not put on muscle that fast. It's just not how this works. So with that, fast forward to around the 1990s, and this is when the science of sports science is really starting to emerge, and the myth that lifting weights makes you muscle bound and slow was completely busted. And instead, it was shown that no, strength training is great. We can actually have the body adapt in terms of its force production and athlete speed, and we need athletes to lift weights. But at this time, we're really only exposing our male athletes to it, because remember, females are kind of new to this high competitive level. So 10 years after exposing females to a high competitive level, now we see that ACL injuries are this huge epidemic in female athletes. Fast forward to 2019, and 50% of high school male athletes are required to strength train, yet less than 10% of female athletes are. And still, females have about a 2 to 6 times higher chance of experiencing ACL injury. Again, we know that tissues are adaptable and we can change the resiliency of the ACL, and this is by external loading. However, we're requiring more males versus females. Is this by chance why females are experiencing ACL injuries at a much higher rate, especially knowing that ACL injuries are an overuse injury? And finally, most importantly, strength training can reduce the chance of an overuse injury by 50%. This has been cited in another review article in 2013. Strength training is the most important and effective risk reduction tool. And this is most important during teenage years, because during teenage years, boys experience this big spurt of muscular strength and motor performance. So they have a big spike of testosterone, and that spike is what tells not only their muscles get stronger, but their neuromuscular system to kind of connect. Basically, they understand how to use this concurrent increase of muscle mass. Females do not have the same spike. So instead, their bones and bodies are growing, their muscles are not growing at the same rate, and they don't have that same neuromuscular spurt, meaning they don't really have that mind-body connection of how to move in coordination with one another. And this is not ideal when this is really the main age where most females are experiencing a high chance of an ACL injury. So we see this big discrepancy, and that's between muscular strength. So we know that strength training can reduce the chance of an overuse injury by 50%. And female athletes are experiencing ACL injuries at such a higher rate compared to men. However, women's participation in resistance training is much lower than men. So that makes us question why. Is it because of social expectations of how the female body should look? Is this because of the belief that weightlifting is more masculine? Is this also because oftentimes coaches, especially in the high school level, are going to tell an athlete to train the way that they train? So 20 years ago, a female athlete most definitely was not exposed to strength training. So if this is now your coach, there's a lower chance of her exposing your daughter to strength training, and this stuff has to change. Finally, a lot of sports-specific programs or sex-specific often underload females because we are just assuming that females are naturally weaker, and that's not what this means. This means that females have not been given the chance to get their body stronger, and we need to progressively overload them. Just because men are starting here, females can catch up as long as we expose them to the right type of program. And then finally, really, strength and conditioning coaches are most overwhelmingly men. This is a very male-dominated field. And in that case, sometimes it's very overwhelming for a female to feel comfortable if this looks like an all-male environment, for a female to actually feel like this is where she belongs. A big reason why Relentless is female only. So big takeaway here is that the biomechanics, how a body moves, is influenced by strength. The body moves where it feels most strong. Our muscles and joints are impacted by external loading or the weight of our life experiences. So this is a really cool overall injury cycle of the ACL, but overall, this is just really coming down to help us understand that we are under-preparing our female athletes. Competition of females is at a much higher competitive level than it ever has been before. And yet, females are not being required to strength train. We have coaches that are having our athletes practice 5 days a week for 2 hours instead of taking 1 day off and giving them the one tool that we know will not only improve their performance, but drastically reduce their chance of an overuse injury, such as an ACL tear. So this really brings into play what this article is all about, and is that we can address a factor by modifying the environment, not just the individual. This means having conversations with coaches, having them understand that if you give your athlete 1 day out of the sport practice and instead push her to go to the weight room, it's going to pay dividends, because your athletes are going to be more resilient and last on the field longer, as well as play better. We can't tell girls to get stronger to reduce their chance of injury if we don't actually create an environment that supports that type of activity. So overall, what is known, there's a huge disparity between the ACL injury rates between male and females, and addressing this in terms of a sex difference is very multifactorial, complex, and looking at it through that lens has not changed the incidence of injuries in over 20 years. So what do we know? That if we look at gender in terms of how we have different type of training program for athletes, this has not really been studied. And this is a really important field that we really need to start delving into. Gender is extrinsic, meaning we can change the differences between genders by many type of external loading by training. So overall, for our coaches, this really meant for us to understand, how can we better educate our athletes and parents? Are girls actually predisposed to getting injured? What can we do to help decrease that chance? What do we say to female athletes and parents that say they don't have time to lift? Is it because she tore her ACL during her period? And this is all the resounding answer is no. Strength training is the main tool that we can use to drastically decrease the chance of an overuse injury, such as an ACL tear, by 50%. And more female athletes need to understand this fact, and they need to be exposed to an environment that promotes this type of training. That's obviously the type of environment that we're really trying to strive for here at Relentless, but overall, we want to see this impact female athletes across the nation. Thanks for watching.